I've been given the honour of introducing the day, as you've just heard, and what I'm about to say is not based on any independent research. Let me tell you that. It is merely aimed at introducing us to the Archbishop and Mrs. Mowll and sketching an outline of their lives. I begin with an event which may never have happened, but which should have. It's an old story. I think it's true. It is the night of the Archbishop's enthronement in St Andrew's Cathedral. There is a crowd, bustle, splendour as the Archbishop gets ready to enter. From his shoulders flowing a cloak with a long train, choir boys getting ready to carry it. It is March the 13th, 1934, in the midst of the Great Depression. A drunk passes by and, seeing the throng, asks what's going on. On being told that it was the welcome to the new Archbishop from England, he makes an classic Aussie crack. With so many out of work here, why do we have to import a bloody pommy as an Archbishop? Well, you may ask. Sydney did not elect its first local or even Australian Archbishop until 32 years later. So strong was the commitment to King, Church and Empire. The Archbishop came, swathed with pre-existent glory, Cambridge educated, and always in love with his alma mater, by the way, consecrated in Canterbury Cathedral, one of a recognisable leadership elite, not averse to exercising authority in a very direct way, commanding in stature and in voice. But was he a fit choice for Sydney? Although he was indisputably English in speech and manner, he had not spent the previous years in a comfortable vicarage at home, looking up occasionally from the Times crossword puzzle. Aged only 43, Mowll had already been bishop for 11 years, serving in West China. Before that, from 1913 until 1922, with a brief time off as army chaplain in France, he was a member of the faculty of Wycliffe College, Toronto. Both in Canada and in China, his time was marked by travel, adventure, and peril for the sake of the gospel, whether in visiting the far-flung graduates of Wycliffe College in Canada, in the vastness of Canada, or journeying to the clergy and the churches in China. He and his wife, Dorothy, endured kidnap, assault, and bullets. In fact, I mentioned this to someone the other day and he said, well, don't you remember the pictures we had in our home with bullet marks in them that came from the Mowlls? That was a son of the Curl family. At the same time, they gave themselves unstintingly to the cause of the gospel, to building up churches and to advancing local leadership. We preach not ourselves, was the text of his first sermon in the cathedral, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. Dorothy Mowll, we're going to hear more about Dorothy from Jane Tour in a little while, was born in June 1890, just 6 months after Howard. But whereas he was born and grew up in Dover in a prosperous middle-class home, she was the daughter of CMS missionaries and spent the first 4 years of her life in West China experiencing the language and the culture. After her education in England, which included work in teaching and in medical work, she fulfilled her ambition to be a missionary and returned to the land of her birth. Her vigour and her enthusiasm were and remain throughout her life absolutely remarkable. It appears that it was not obvious to her that they should marry, but it was obvious to Howard Mowll, and he pursued his ambition with characteristic zeal, and they were married in October 1923. Over the next 33 years, Their ministries and their personalities complemented each other with joint achievements which have had lasting effect. They had no children, but even more than usual, when thinking of an episcopal ministry, it is not possible to think of one without the other. To this day, we benefit from their joint ministry. In the election, and we'll hear more about this from Ed Lone, in the election, evangelicals such as the principal of Mowll College of the day and the dean of the cathedral of the day were understandably keen to secure the election of one like themselves. Archdeacon H.W.K, I believe, was the one that they were wanting elected. However, those whose tradition went back to Nathaniel Jones and to Bishop Barker supported Bishop Mowll, and they won the day, not without some bitterness and later repercussions. It was hotly contested, rightly, as we can now see, because the result of that election set the course for the Diocese of Sydney until this present day. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, had told Mowll that, quote, he possessed neither the gifts nor the training which the See of Sydney required. This you'll find in Archbishop Lone's book. And pivotal though this moment was, it did not necessarily mean that the right choice had been made. Cosmo Gordon Lang certainly didn't think so. After all, he had tried to learn Chinese in his 10 years in China, but he'd made little progress. Could he learn Australian? Who was this man? Well, as you will hear in every talk today, I guess, he was imposingly tall, like Bishop Barker. You'll remember that the big beer in the pubs in the 19th century were called Barkers because they were named after Bishop Barker, the big man. Mowll had a voice which could fill any hall. He seems to have relied on others, not least Dorothy, for a number of the practical things of life, which reminds me of at least one of his successors. Sir Marcus Lone tells us that he was courteous but reserved in manner, although he was also the sort of man around whom stories would cluster. You only have to mention Mowll and you begin to get the flow of stories in, like two I heard this week, one of which was the jungle doctor, Paul White, and he walking down the street and in Pitt Street or somewhere or other, and a sort of a beggar comes and sees the Archbishop and makes a beeline for him to see if he can get some money out of him. And Paul White says to the beggar, "This is my side of the street, mate. You go to the other side." Only Paul White, if you knew Paul. He was also the sort of man around whom stories would cluster, and there was no doubting his will and his purpose and his energy and his strength. He was famous indeed for ringing people up at midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning, thinking about business. He was always on the job. But is this what Sydney needed? Some of what we're looking for in answer to that question goes back to those Cambridge days, for he was shaped, formed, made by his Cambridge student experience. For a record 5 terms, he was the president of the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union, record up till that point. Immediately after the Great Split with the student Christian movement over the absolute centrality of the cross of Christ, understood to be a penal substitution. A great split. The Cambridge men, as they were, stood firm. And that split goes on till this day. At that time, while he was doing this, he was merely 21 years old. But true to the evangelical ethos of the time, and I would say afterwards as well, through participation in missions and beach missions and open-air preaching and personal evangelism, which he'd been doing already, he learned the skills which made him such a formidable leader, yes, at the university, but always straight away afterwards. It's no accident that he was recruited to go to Wycliffe immediately after he left university, virtually. Central to this, central to his activities, central to the way in which he did things, was his powerful evangelical conviction. For only those who are deeply conservative can be truly innovative. These convictions prepared him to stand for the truth of the gospel in the midst of debate. They also drove him to a new and lasting work to promote the same gospel. For Mowll was never going to be staying in England and just being a country vicar. He always had the whole world in his vision. He was not merely a cultural Anglican, but first and foremost an evangelical Christian with a worldwide vision. And interestingly, and again I heard this story a couple of weeks ago, one of the first things he did on arrival in Australia was to get himself onto the council of the Interdenominational Katoomba Convention and to work with them over the years, showing therefore his background probably in the Keswick Convention, but also in world mission. He worked with them over the years, and he always wanted to be there and on the platform on the Thursday night of the Katoomba Convention week, which was the mission night. And he wanted to be there for that, which shows you where his heart lay. He was a mission-driven evangelical Anglican. Evangelical first, Anglican second. Let me come clean to the question I've raised. Was he the right man? Was he the right man for mid-20th century Sydney, Pommy though he was? Absolutely. Bishop Barker was a great bishop. You can form your own opinion as the day goes on as to whether Archbishop Mowll also falls into that rare category of a great archbishop. Naturally, Jane Barker and Dorothy were integral to whatever success they had, interestingly. Dorothy died in December 1957. Howard died 10 months later, October 1958, at the age of 68. As the day proceeds, you will hear more about their accomplishments. And I say their accomplishments. But just as the legacy of the Barkers included Mowll College, the Home Mission Society, or the Church Society as it was called, and St Catherine's School for the education of clergy daughters, so the legacy of the Mowlls included the Youth Department and Senef, and you'll hear more about this from Ruth a little while, the Anglican retirement villages, Mowll Village, as well as the rejuvenation of Mowll College and the Home Mission Society, and widespread church planting, which the principal will be talking to us about as well in terms of Mowll College. I ought to include his ability, which is one of those key things in leadership, to choose and advance the leaders of the next generation, notably Graham Delbridge, Clive Curl and Marcus Loane. And also his willingness to put T.C. Hammond, if you just think about it for a moment, the tall, imposing Englishman from Dover, and T.C. Hammond, the Irishman from Dublin, that is not a good mix. But they did, and Mowll College, he was the principal of Mowll College under Mowll, and they worked together. But preeminently, Mowll did what every Archbishop of Sydney should do. That is, make the diocese more evangelical than he found it. Not for party political reasons, of course, but for the sake of the preaching of the gospel and the salvation of souls. He was not alone in doing this. The diocese was certainly not absolutely subservient to him by any means, and several times he suffered losses on the floor of synod. When he intervened in a debate, the synod simply voted against him. They were not going to be pushed around by him. This is Sydney, after all. People stood up to him, people dissented from him, people were critical of him. And a story again I heard just this week, a clergyman who the Archbishop felt should move on from his parish, and the Archbishop told him several times. The clergyman was fairly inept, one believes. And here it was who told my brother this story many years later, still in the same parish. And he got rather tired of the Archbishop ringing him at all hours and telling him he should move on. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, he rang the Archbishop and he said, "Archbishop, I agree with you. I believe St Mark's Darling Point is available and I'm happy to go there." And it was the last he heard, and he stayed in the parish till the end. So people did stand up to him. But without him, the pivot away from liberal evangelicalism would not have occurred, and we would not be sitting here today. You only need to trace the history of Mowll College to see that. He worked with energy and an eye for detail, famous eye for detail, in the diocese. I've just heard another story about him from Philip Gerber, actually, about the Archbishop visiting the Gerber home and seeing one of the children there and saying, "How's your toe?" Didn't know what he was talking about. Well, the last time the Archbishop had visited 2 or 3 years before, the boy had had a stubbed toe. And the Archbishop remembered 3 years later. But that was Archbishop Mowll. He remembered everything. And I suspect Mrs. Mowll did the same. He did not delegate easily. He did not allow criticism to deter him from his great evangelical passion. Both Dorothy and he worked with energy and enthusiasm during the war days, doing all they could to look after the members of the armed forces on leave or training in Sydney, and we'll hear much more about that from Colin Bale later in the day. In those days, the Archbishop was a national figure, and it is indicative of how well he was known and respected that there were no fewer than 150,000 people lining the streets of the city at his funeral. But as well, as time went on and his leadership capacity was recognised, he was made Primate of Australia, overcoming an earlier hostility, and in spite of having to weather the Red Book case, which Robert Tong is going to talk to us about. As Primate, he travelled and visited extensively around the nation, and especially after the war, he and Dorothy engaged in much overseas travel, not least in China, and he became involved in the early stages of the World Council of Churches. It is not surprising that from his base, it is not surprising that from his base in faraway Sydney, he became a global figure, especially in evangelical circles. Jeff Trelaw is going to talk to us about his time as Primate and so forth. But I myself wonder whether his extended absences from the diocese were in its best interests. I would raise that issue. His agreement with the constitution of the Australian Anglican Church was fundamental to its success, as was the support of T.C. Hammond. This meant that the doubts of people like Knox and Robinson were overcome in the synod. But even here, Mowll only approved the constitution because it safeguarded what he called the Protestant and Reformed character of the Church of England, a viewpoint which he saw as the tradition of this diocese, which he was bound to protect. Was this Pommy the right man? Well, in 1954, as was the custom in those days, there was an awards ceremony in the chapter house where children who had done well, now some of you won't even believe this existed, but believe me, it did. Children who had done well in the diocesan Sunday school exams. Okay. Anyone here did the diocesan Sunday school exam? See, I have witnesses. Robert Tong claims to have done it. Okay. Well, there was a ceremony at which those who had done well received a certificate. Jim Spence was in the chair, apparently, if you know who I mean. The person handing out the awards, however, was the Archbishop. My brother Philip tells me he received an award, and I know I did. I can only remember the actual moment that I was given the certificate. I stuck my hand up, I was, I suppose, 10 years old, and I stuck my hand up like this in order to shake hands with the mountainous man that stood before me. I cannot forget that moment. I've never forgotten that moment. And it was a moment in which, strangely, that the present moment then shook hands with a remote future and looked down from a great height with a kindly, if totally unsuspecting eye. But between that moment and the long in the distance future was the Billy Graham crusade, in which my infant faith, and that of so many others, became real and living, and salvation arrived. Without the Archbishop, as we all know, Billy Graham would not have received such a welcome to Australia. Other Anglicans opposed the invitation, but such was the respect with which Mowll was held that he united and inspired the Protestant churches as a whole. Remember the Katoomba Convention and the World Council of Churches. And although he did not live to see the results, dying just a few months before the crusade, the 1959 crusade was in many ways a consequence of Archbishop Mowll's work. In 2012, a friend showed me an email he had received from Jerry Bevan, one of Billy Graham's team on that 59 crusade. And Jerry Bevan recalls in this email that when the initial discussions were being held about the crusade in 1957, he dined at Bishop's Court and afterwards prayed in the chapel with Dr. Mowll. Quote, as we knelt there, Mowll said, pray for me, Brother Jerry. Me, a 38-year-old Southern Baptist, being asked to pray for perhaps the strongest evangelical voice in the world. It is a moment I can never forget. Written in 2012. We're going to have a wonderful day. Thinking about the Archbishop and Mrs. Mowll, I've been so grateful to be asked to do this because I've had to do all sorts of thinking and reading about it. Remember this, however, at the heart of everything he did and accomplished was a deep piety, a piety which I think is going to be illustrated by Stuart, who was there, missed you, brother. Whether he was a great, as discernible if you read the marginalia of his Bible, whether he was a great archbishop, and I leave you to judge that, we know that both he and Dorothy were also, like the rest of us, miserable sinners. They used to say so very frequently. Their faithfulness, zeal, and energy arose first and foremost from the assurance that they had received, that they trusted the Christ who died in their place on the cross. We will give thanks for both of them, and rightly so. We will learn from them, and rightly so. But if they were here today, they would say to us, remember this, brothers and sisters, we do not preach ourselves, but we preach Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake.